Welcome to the Quantum Guide Show, where you will find interesting guests and discussions about cutting-edge topics to assist you on your journey. The Quantum Guide Show is ideally suited to the newly awakened and for those who feel isolated by their newfound beliefs. The mind, body, and spirit thrive when we have a mission, and there is no greater mission than to become the change that we wish to see in the world. So hit the like button, subscribe to my YouTube, Odyssey, and Telegram channels, and share this show with your friends. Welcome back to the Quantum Guide Show. Today in episode 128, I'm very happy to introduce you to my special guest, Frank Jacob, writer, director, and researcher. Frank Jacob is an international award-winning filmmaker, presenter, visual artist, musician, and composer. Having teamed up with the U.S. motion picture production company Screen Addiction, his recent films explore the frontiers of consciousness-raising subjects in the films called Solar Revolution, The Klaus-Dona Chronicles, and Packing for Mars. In March 2022, Frank broke a story about a mysterious group called the Guardians of the Looking Glass, who claimed to be a breakaway faction of the controversial Project Looking Glass, having resurfaced to help humanity avert upcoming disasters, which exploded onto the internet. This time technology makes it possible to peer into timelines, future probabilities, and more, and appears to be used by rogue elements in government as well as the elite to bring about a technocratic dictatorship. He followed up with A Tale of Two Timelines, a webinar that dives deep into the history and main protagonists of that story, which connects consciousness, ETs, CERN, AI, time travel, interdimensional messages, the meaning of timelines, and an upcoming cosmic event with the power to propel mankind into a quantum evolutionary leap long predicted by Indigenous people around the world. As a presenter, Frank's multimedia presentations take his audiences deep down the rabbit hole into the hidden history, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, secret technology, human evolution, timelines, and parallel worlds. Today, we're going to talk about the inner looking glass, Frank's latest webinar. Is the pineal gland a gateway to higher dimensions and modalities of consciousness? Since the 1950s, this mysterious organ has been at the center of top secret classified studies in human consciousness. In this three-part deep dive into your inner looking glass, you'll learn cutting-edge intel about why this mysterious gland is the key to your awakening. Parts 1, 2, and 3 are now available, and the links are given below. Frank, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Karen. I'm very well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm just really excited to hear more about your webinar.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's in 3 parts. I thought maybe we could start off by you talking a little bit about the origin, part 1, and let people know what they would be learning about in that first section of the webinar.
Well, the inner looking glass webinar, the naming of it and everything, I guess it came about after I had webinar A Tale of Two Timelines, which was all about the Project Looking Glass itself. And during the course of the research and the production of that webinar and digging into what the whistleblowers told us and what the Looking Glass Guardians who emerged, who were part of that webinar and part of the reason that I even really got out there with this whole Looking Glass story to begin with, we're talking about its discovery in sort of prehistoric times. And one of the whistleblowers involved in the project Looking Glass, or not directly in Looking Glass, but who was involved with the people that were running that project, Dan Burish, who described it to us the first time, was in communication with a future human, which are called J-rods, who kind of were the source of how we found out about it in the first place. And when you find out that it goes back to this prehistoric time, to the Sumerian cylinder seals, that of course made me very curious. And so what emerges is that you find out that the pineal gland has significance that goes all the way very back to the very beginning foundations of civilization. And so that's why I ended up calling the first part Origin, because, on the one hand, the first part of the webinar talks about, it covers the basics about, what is a pineal gland. Most people don't really know, what it is, and except for hardcore New Agers out there. I mean, there's information out there about the pineal gland, of course, but I wanted this to be, a Frank Jacob webinar, so it's not covering everything everybody else has already covered about the web and about the pineal gland. So it was very important for me to kind of tie in these, not just the functionality, where it is, what it looks like, but to go back and trace back to really the roots of where it came from to begin with. And that led on a very, very interesting trail. And that's why I guess when I was piecing it together to begin with, I had this mountain of data. And it really was an innocent, it started off very innocent because I was at over Christmas last winter, I was with our colleague, associate Dieter Breurs, who's a biophysicist, a best-selling author, and who's into a lot of this material. And we've worked on some of the films with him called Solar Revolution, for example. And he had released a new book about the pineal gland, and it was called The Pineal Gland Classified. So, it was called Verschlusssache Zirbeldrüse, which is the German version of that. And he was saying, well, why don't you do, I was talking to him about, well, I've got to come up with a follow-up to this webinar because a lot of people are asking what's next. And so he goes like, why don't you take that as a subject? And I'm like, okay. So I dug into his book, and it was fascinating. And that really kind of led me, but there were a lot of holes, things that I would like to see discussed, which weren't in that. So I did a little bit of a different approach this time. I said to him, okay, why don't I interview you? I'll read the book, I'll interview you, and we'll use it as a jump off point to go, deeper down the rabbit hole. And that was kind of the start of it. And and I didn't know exactly how many parts it would be, but usually it turns out that you just can't do this in an hour and a half. I mean, you can do that if if you just want to do a surface. Let's just tell people, like, there's a lot of these 20-minute, hour-long videos out there, but to really go deep into a subject, I found out that I had to tie in all this prehistoric stuff as well, because that was like probably one of the most fascinating things that blew my mind, because we had covered some of this material previously. Tawny Maidenford, my production partner, and I were doing talks about prehistoric civilization, because we've done films with Klaus Donner, for example, who's an out of place artifacts researcher. And one of the things that comes up is this ancient connection. So that seemed to suddenly connect to it. And it was like a what do you say? A full circle reconnect on that subject. So that was, I think, connecting dots in a place in a way that nobody ever has before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'm kind of a big fan of ancient archaeology and forbidden knowledge and that sort of thing. And over and over and over again, it surfaces in the image of a pine cone from the oldest cuneiform writings. I don't know what you call it, the engravings on temple walls and things like that. So I think the ancients have been trying to tell us something for a long time. And what I also found interesting is the Vatican has this huge image of the pine cone, which I believe symbolizes the pineal gland, right in front of the Vatican. So it's kind of like been staring at us in plain sight throughout history. And now you've put it all together for us. So that, I'm sure that part one is going to be super, super interesting. And do you want to say a little something about the science, or do you want to get into that in the part two on the insight, which is part two of the webinar?
Well, the part two of the webinar is delves into a lot of the philosophical basis. And then there's, well, in part one, I cover some of this ancient history, and not so much science, I think, Well, there's some science in it, because you find out that essentially, and this is something that I've talked about also in the Tale of Two Timelines, is that the pineal gland connects us to the earth, and it does that through the fact that it resonates at the same frequency. And so this is an important thing that had to be covered, and it had to be explained in a way that was, I guess, clear for people who are not scientific to understand what that means. And putting the webinar together was, I think I even said it at some point, kind of like peeling the layers of an onion. You just go more and more into it. So the first part covers some basics functionality, what it does, and the body, like just what its physiological function is in the standard version of science. But then it kind of takes, a hard left and goes, really off the deep end into these, like you mentioned about the pine cone being a symbol. Yeah, that is the case. The pine cone is the symbol for the pineal gland. But why exactly is it the symbol? And this is some of the stuff that we cover in the first part. And the second part is more about, like, why is it that this, has been prevalent in our culture? It's almost like you say, there's this symbology in our culture, which has always been there to tell us, there it is right in front of our eyes. But nobody's really made it clear exactly why and what. And also we talk about, I think in the second part, if I'm not mistaken, and just remember, I've just gone through like mountains of this stuff. So I'm trying to think, oh yeah, I think we talk about why it's classified. I mean, the thing is that because I was asking Dieter Burst, like, why did you call the book, pineal gland classified, right? Because it's just an organ in your brain. Why should it be classified? And that was a very interesting part, because that leads you into realizing that, if the research behind consciousness is tied to the pineal gland, and this is why it's classified. And it has to do with the fact that without a pineal gland, there's really no connection to your higher self. In other words, no pineal gland, no awakening. End of story, And this is, I think, what separates us as human beings who, and there's other creatures with pineal glands, but ours has an extended functionality. And it's that extended functionality which is the classified stuff. So I go into some of that classified material, some of the pioneers involved in those classified studies, and what they found.
I got a question for you. There seems to be a real rise in materialism, which may or may not correspond to, the toxins in our environment and electromagnetic radiation. But I'm curious, and there's also a huge rise, I believe, in psychopathy, the whole narcissist, empathy deficient human beings. There seems to be so many. Why are some of us, like from the time I can remember, I've been able to do lucid dreaming, I've been in contact with the spirit realms. Why are some of us able to do that and others become empathy deficient or more psychopathic? Like, I don't think I'm anybody special. I struggle with, vices and flaws just like everybody else. But why is it that some of us have this, I'm going to call it a gift?
Well, I think the key word that you just mentioned was empathy. And it has to do with your connection to your inner self, your higher self, because when you're more connected to finer, subtler things, higher frequency thoughts, just better structured information, you become a more emotionally evolved person. You become more mature emotionally, and you begin to tap into what it is that the pineal gland is giving us, and it's this direct connection that it connected to another part of our brain, which is the hippocampus. So those two, well, there's also the pituitary, and there's a couple of others, and we get into that as well. But those two, the hippocampus and the pineal gland, are important because they work together to give us those pictures, and it's the pictures that allow us to give it a basis in reality, so to speak, and that make sense for us. Like, we need some kind of stimulus, and the hippocampus is part of the brain that is responsible for memory, especially long-term memory and stuff. And essentially, it's that ability for us to envision and visualize things. So when we have a vision and we want to visualize a new world, the fifth, world, or what the Hopis call the next world, or or the next dimension, or whatever people call it. There's all sorts of terms for it, but we need that ability to visualize it in order to resonate with it. And part of resonating with that higher vibrational world is getting in touch and being more attuned with empathy. And it's interesting you said that about narcissism, because I've noticed that a lot of things are coming up about narcissists lately. And it's, it's like amazing because, Tanya and I have talked about this as well. She's had her own experience with narcissistic people. I've seen them around, and different personalities is another thing that we talked about today. It's like different personalities will have different reactions when they confront narcissists. Like narcissists they seek out certain types of people, and it's almost like they can tell that when somebody's empathic, that hasn't maybe developed a strong defense shield, that they will prey upon these empathic people to sort of vampirically suck their energy from them to build themselves up. And the other thing that you find out is that a lot of people that are narcissists are hurt people that are they just want other people to hurt as well. So that's one of the reasons that they like to hurt people, so that they can feel what they feel. And that's just another form of emotional immaturity. In other words, not processing that feeling of hurt. And so that may seem to indicate that narcissists have an inability or a block when it comes to connecting with their pineal gland, which would open them up to these insights. And that's another thing that we talk about in part 2 of the webinar, insights, because this is like there's external vision and there's the internal vision, right? And the pineal gland is actually made of the same material as the retina. So it's almost like we have literally a physical eye within the middle of our brain, made of the same stuff as our outside eye. And it's really amazing to think about like that. And that's some of the stuff that we talk about in 2 as well. As that like why what is that all about with this eye? And there's actual cultural signs that the one-eyed persons and there's even creatures that have eyes on top of their skulls that are exposed. And a lot of the science in the world about in the human physiology looks at the pineal gland as being this deficient, atrophied organ that shrinks and becomes insignificant and just shoots out, a bit of serotonin or melatonin without really placing the real importance on why it is what it is and what it's there for. And then the other thing that you learn is that, and you touched upon it a little bit as well, is that there's been these toxins in our environment. So, is there a connection between the rise of narcissism and the increase of toxicity in our environment? Because precisely the 3 most vicious poisons in our environment are those poisons which are the ones that target the pineal gland. It's just uncanny, right? Just like you'd think, wow, what a coincidence that is, right? I mean, out of the millions of chemicals that are out there, it's those 3, particular chemicals that are the ones that go right for the pineal gland. And those are the ones that coat it as well and block it. So maybe, what happens to some people is that tend to narcissism is they become blocked very early on, and maybe something in their lives hurts them and they can't process it, so they become cruel. And I think it's probably an involuntary cruelty in the beginning, but if they don't fix it or process it or have help around them to solve it or are open to solving it, it becomes dark. It becomes evil, and it feeds the need to continue and they harden, in the world. And there's a lot of really dark events that happen out there because of narcissism. Yeah, and it's just bizarre. We watched a film the other day called The Beanie Baby Bubble or something like that. And it was, not really a film that would interest me, but what was interesting is when you're watching the film, you realize it's really all about narcissism, because the the beanie bubble guy, the baby guy, really like was the perfect example of a narcissist. Here were all these women around him who were empathic, who were geniuses, who opened up the world to him, and he gave him all this stuff. And then he became the face of it, and he became, oh, it's all me, it's all mine, and I did this, and me and my, all this stuff, right? And in the end, it all crumbles. So the film is actually a symbol for the ideal path of a narcissist's, trip. And then the difference being that I think some of the other co-protagonists in the film were able to figure out a way to escape the victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess tying it back to the pineal gland. The pineal gland is the organ in our brain which helps us to navigate those events in our life around the matrix around us, and it connects us to higher dimensions of reality. So if we practice using it, and if we practice becoming aware of what it is and what it does, it's like any instrument or like any organ or muscle in your body. It becomes more and more attuned to your life and to your daily actions and interactions. Mm-hmm. And so it ties you into a perspective to how to deal with the outside world matrix much better, especially in terms also of what is coming down the pipeline, because we all kind of feel that life as normal, which changed with the whole COVID thing, mm-hmm. is never going to return, and we're heading toward some event that is going to change. It'll be probably the biggest change that we've gone through ever in our modern civilization. And so the pineal gland being something you're connected with and understanding and working with, which opens you up to these greater concepts and maybe puts you more in tune and makes you more comfortable dealing with the kind of information that you're going to be dealing with, will better prepare you for some of the biggest changes that are going to be coming our way.
Oh, yeah, I would agree 100%. Now, on a personal note, what happened to me is I've always had, contact with the spirit realms and my higher self. And but when I started, like about 20 years ago, when we started having, videos on the internet and things like that, one of the first things that my guides directed me to was anything I could find on the pineal gland and the spiritual aspects of the pineal gland and how to protect my pineal gland. I live in Red Deer, Alberta, and the water's very heavily fluoride here. And it's interesting because there's so many churches. It's sort of the Bible Belt of Canada, and yet there's so little spirituality. People are very materialistic, and it's all about the money and the things money can buy. And so the people that are more interested in the spiritual aspects of life are not just shunned, but also belittled and looked down upon. But I got to say, in the last 3 years, this whole COVID thing has really exposed that, in my opinion, all the powers that be all around the world all have empathy deficiency, and something's wrong with them. And I don't know if their pineal glands are broken or what, but I also believe the real power is with those of us who have our pineal glands intact. That is the real power. And but wow, it's almost impossible to break through the consciousness of these people. And I don't run around judging and saying, oh, this person has a calcified pineal gland and this person doesn't. I mean, how would I know? But I'm just saying what the evidence is showing me. And then can you talk a bit about how the electromagnetic radiation, we've never had the kind of frequencies, man-made frequencies that we have today, and it's getting worse, how that's sort of also tied in?
Well, what you find out is that the DNA, our DNA, the way, our building plans of humanity, the human genome, is very, very amazingly structured, and to form two different kinds of antennas, which are fractal. It's like a fractal antenna. Our DNA is a fractal antenna. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really felt was important also in I think part 3 of the webinar was talking about the structure of the universe in a new way, and in ways that most people aren't familiar with, getting away from the Big Bang and this whole external form of of the universe, that it's all accident and colliding of rocks and molecules, through eternity until one day consciousness arises, and instead looking at it in terms of the fractal nature of it all and tying it more into the electric universe, which also explains, interestingly and amazingly, some of the hypotheses of Velikovsky and David Talbot and some others that were talking about how the universe, our solar system, didn't always have the same arrangement of planetary bodies that it has now, and that those went through sudden, rapid changes at certain points, and that those changes are reflected in our culture. And so you find evidence of the fact that this really indeed was that way. And what it comes down to is you figure out that everything from the microcosm to the macrocosm, which is one of the big themes of the webinar that I keep coming back to, is like this connection between microcosm and macrocosm, is that our pineal gland is that connection in the DNA of the human DNA, as a fractal antenna, is connected to the entire universe in a way. And that I won't really try to explain here. I do a pretty good job explaining it, I think, in part 3 with, some diagrams and some, depictions to help you understand it a little bit better. It has to do with the electron as well. But because the DNA is a fractal antenna, and fractal antennas are something that engineers drool over, because the reason that they can get fractal, the reason that we have these, these little devices sitting in our pocket and connecting to the World Wide Web is because of one thing only, because of fractal antennas. If you can properly engineer an antenna to be fractal, you can pick up all kinds of frequencies. You can pick them up, and if you need to change really quickly because the bands change, or you can really design them so that we have this amazing ability to pick up microwaves and translate them into data. But the downside of that is, so does our DNA. And our DNA as a fractal antenna is being hit by those same electrosmog frequencies, and there isn't really much being talked about in science. In fact, it's being suppressed, and there's lots of stories about that. I don't go so much into that in the webinar, but I talk about it a little bit, and we explain why it's fractal and what that means. But essentially, the fractal nature of our human DNA means that it's easy to shatter with destructive microwave frequencies and damage it. And we may not even know the extent of that damage until much further down the line. In fact, it might actually be shutting off certain functionality. Now, this is interesting because we talk about how these projects on the study of consciousness in the pineal gland were classified. And it has to do with the fact that they've already figured out back in the 40s and 50s already, and 60s, they began to really learn that they could control people's minds through the use of frequency. And so it can't really be a true thing that people think that it's just accidental, that there could be some people that might get affected, and that the telecom people tell you, no, all the studies have been done, it's all safe, that's all just, it's a conspiracy theory. That just simply can't be true, because in the 60s, they knew precisely how to control people's minds. There's this Leda machine that was, Ross Addy was in charge. He got his hands on this Russian machine that they used to control psychiatric patients in the 60s. They could mind control them with this frequency machine. And the frequencies that this machine worked at were 147 megahertz. And it's interesting because that corresponds almost precisely to the frequency of the human DNA, which is 150 megahertz. So is that coincidence? I hardly think so, right? Because if you were a person in charge of sculpting or crafting or building society so that you could limit people in terms of their thinking and steer them toward, some kind of a whatever you keep them busy with, to just keep them productive in society without being too powerful, but just doing their thing so that you could maintain power. And about this, which they do because they're the ones that are funding these studies, then what better way to extend that control from chemicals in the food supply right up on through to frequencies that attack that particular part of our existence, which would open up functionality of humanity, which is the next level of humanity that we're going to be moving into.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a coincidence? That's the big question, right? Is that a conspiracy? So I definitely cover some of that in the webinar so that you can make you can have a look at that, because a lot of people, I hate to immediately say, oh, it's a conspiracy in this. But the thing is, it is a very strange coincidence that precisely chemicals and frequencies that correspond to actually interfering with functionality of our body to put us to higher levels of thinking and our dimensions of reality are the ones that are the most prevalent in society right now.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting that the same year that the MK Ultra mind control programs got into full swing is when all those UFO cults like the Heaven's Gate and them also started all at the same time. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. But I wanted to say something about where you were saying about how, sorry, I have too many thoughts in my mind all at once. I wanted to ask you. I was thinking about how I believe psychedelics alter the receiver wavelength, and that is how we're able to perceive other realities that commonly are not perceived. I'm wondering, is there a connection between DMT and the pineal gland? Because I understand that we naturally produce it. I've even wondered in the past if partly how I'm able to do the amount of lucid dreaming and contact that I've had, which has been extraordinary, do I leak DMT somehow?
Yeah, this is the thing about the pineal gland that is, I think, another thing that separates us from other beings that have, or creatures that have, a pineal gland. It is that the pineal gland is something that, as Axelrod, a Nobel Prize winning chemist, found out about, is that the pineal gland actually produces dimethyltryptamine. And that was one of the things we explored in our film Solar Revolution, because in that film we were trying to say, we were following the premise that, is there some kind of an externally induced event like the Maya we're talking about, the Hunab coup, or something that's going to come from external forces, which could actually cause a mass change in civilization, a mass enlightenment in civilization. And so on the path of trying to pursue that thesis, we of course ended up with Rick Strassman, who is, I think, the only clinical psychologist who who had the idea to kind of put together a clinical study with volunteers who were exposed to dimethyltryptamine in larger quantities to see what would happen to them, what would happen to their consciousness. Hold on, my cat just opened the door. Give me a second. Rocco. He opens doors. You can't keep him out. So, yeah. And so so it's interesting because we explored that material in terms of some of the footage that was documented when people were exposed to dimethyltryptamine, what they experienced. And it gives you a kind of a glimpse into what that fifth dimensional world, or what that next other dimensional world might actually be perceived as from direct experiencers, which I actually also included in the webinar. I took some excerpts from our film to put it in so people would have an idea as well, because I thought that's important to show, not because I want to promote drug use or taking DMT by any means, but it's an interesting perspective, because when you're very, very young, like I'm talking between the years of 0 to 5 or 6, the pineal gland has a much more dominant prevalence in the biochemistry of your whole organism. And one of the things that it does is emit or secrete dimethyltryptamine in large amounts, so that kids, we often hear these stories about the invisible friends of the babies and the children, right? Who are they talking? They're looking at someone and they're talking to somebody in the room, and parents, there's lots of parents that have had that experience where their children are experiencing it, but because we've been denied in society to explore what that might actually be, what these other dimensions could represent, it usually freaks parents out, or they shut it down, or there's not many parents that are conscious enough or comfortable enough allowing the children to explore that. And so these children are actually getting glimpses into these other dimensions because of the elevated levels of dimethyltryptamine in the body. Now, this starts to change because as you get older, another thing happens, and that's the development of the ego, because your external eyes become the more dominant, because it's funny because babies' eyes are not that evolved, they're like not that developed yet. So it's interesting that when they're very young, their eyes aren't really seeing very much of the world yet. They can see in front of them, but they can't really see in the distance or recognize anything. But instead, they have that inner eye. And that inner eye probably is still perceiving where they just came from, or at least has a deeper connection or a more immediate connection to where they came from, which we talk about in the webinar as well. And so what we found out in our film Solar Revolution is that because through the use of electromagnetic stimulation, and I'm not talking about just the negative kind, which comes from cell towers or from the environment, the electrosmog, but there is a natural form of electrosmog, if you want to call it that, just electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic frequencies, which are based on magnetic fields and electric fields that work together. And that is what stimulates a large part of the biochemical reactions in our bodies, because we are electric beings. We actually have, many, like each cell exudes 0.9 volts of energy. And if you calculate to how many cells we have in the body, we're actually very, very highly charged energetic beings. So we are affected by energetic pulses coming from external sources like solar flares, or like micronovas, or like something else coming from the center of our galaxy, for example, that we talk about in Solar Revolution, with this massive implosion that took place in Sagittarius A, which is a black hole at the center of our galaxy, which ejected a massive pulse of this of radiation and particles and gamma rays and X-rays and all these things that are coming at us, and it's hitting us now. We're at this sweet spot in the environment that is perfect for stimulating us electromagnetically in a natural form. And it's almost, and that is another thing that we explore as well in the webinar, is that there's these series of coincidences that you could say, each event, and there's all these things happening naturally in our environment and in the cosmos that each on their own accord are interesting phenomenally. Like, yeah, that's cool, the more gamma rays coming. But it's interesting that if you can coincide with something else going on, which there's like 5 or 6 other things going on exactly at the same time, which make that no longer just an interesting phenomenon, but actually make it kind of a part of a whole formula, which seems to be geared toward affecting us on a conscious level electromagnetically. And so that would have the effect of stimulating the pineal gland to produce more of something it would normally not do, which is so it's a unique state. It's not saying that we should all go out and start smoking DMT or taking it. It's saying that, look, people have done that. They've done clinical studies, and it's probably better to just leave it at that, because it's a heavy thing to go through that. But they've come back and reported it to us, so we can take their reports and we can prepare ourselves for when we may have our own experience. I almost felt it was irresponsible not to put that into the film Solar Revolution, because, even though we got some criticism because we made it seem like we were promoting that, oh, you do psychedelic drugs and you have this experience, I was thinking, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that what happens if you do suddenly get hit with electromagnetic radiation levels you're not used to, and the Earth's magnetosphere is diminishing, and suddenly you're exposed to this stuff and you start having these what you think are hallucinogenic experiences. You would think you're going crazy, bonkers, and so why not use that information and teach people that it's actually tied to the pineal gland, and it's actually tied to what's going on in the universe. And this is what's going on. So just letting you know, get ready for it and start to practice for when it does happen in real, so that you won't flip out, and so that when it does happen, you ride the wave instead of just running into panic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in the last, especially the last 3 years, I'm seeing like a parting of the waters. Humanity is sort of ending up in two different camps, the believers and the materialists. And it's really interesting. And the gulf seems to be getting wider and wider and wider. Something is happening, but we notice differences in our solar system. Like even just the sun does not look anything like what the sun looked like when I was a child. It was yellow, it was smaller, you could look
Right.
at it for like 10 seconds and then you would see the halo images. But nowadays you can't look at it, it's turned white, it's huge, something's
Right.
happening. And
Yes.
and also, I find that the strength of my ability to cross over dimensions is getting stronger and stronger as well. I often go and lie in the sun, and that's another thing everybody's taught: stay out of the sun, stay out of the sun, and a lot of the chemicals that people are putting on their bodies, 20% of our blood is running through our skin and absorbing those chemicals, and everything seems to be geared to shut down our, well, for lack of a better term, God-given natural gifts that we have. And it's very, very, very interesting. And I'm glad you addressed that issue about the DMT. I don't need to use anything in order for me to do lucid dreaming. And it's really a trip. It's really a trip. I tend to spend a lot of time at home because I never know when it's going to happen. Fortunately, it generally doesn't happen unless I'm at home and alone. But it's a real trip. And I've been taught so many things. I've had so many amazing experiences. But one thing that was really clear was to take good care of my pineal gland. So I've altered my diet. I've altered everything about myself to be able to be in this ready state. And I think something amazing is happening. A lot of people are really terrified of the WEF and that whole thing, and all the so-called elites. I call them the parasite class. And I'm not afraid at all anymore. I have great faith in humanity. There's something amazing coming. And that's the intel that I'm getting from going inside, not from external sources. So Frank, where's all this leading? What do you think is our possibility in the future? What do you see as being kind of an outcome from all of this that's going on?
Well, I mean, I always break it into the idea of the timelines, which is, which I explored in the Tale of Two Timelines webinar that was the predecessor. So, the way I would describe it in simplest terms is that there is a point coming where one timeline will become the dominant timeline, and it will decide if humanity is going to make a leap to this next evolutionary level, or if there's going to be a repeat of the cycle of, that we've been going through these cycles. And, those are, like you mentioned, on the hieroglyphs, what you see depicted, really again and again, this recurring cycle. And we need to break that cycle if we want to reach that next evolutionary level. We can't just keep rising in society to the point where we reach a high level of technology, and then all of a sudden, it all crashes and we go back down to virtually the Middle Ages, and we build back up again and crash down again. And then also the reincarnational cycle, like humanity has to keep reincarnating as a soul to experience the same old misery till one day they finally see through the whole charade and they move on. So, I mean, that has to be broken. And I think the universe wants to break it. And the creator, the grand creator being that created us, out of which we emerged as, creator, like gods with a small g, if you want to call us that. We have that creative ability to actually, we have the assignment to go into the universe and expand the universe in the sense that we are the expansion of the universe. Like rather than this Big Bang idea, which has been hijacked, a hijacking of that concept, the expansion is happening inward, and it's happening in a conscious level. So that has to do with us having these innate, natural, inborn, technologically brilliantly designed biophysical bodies that could do that could inhabit and embody all of these new qualities, and we haven't reached that yet. We've got hints of it. There are people like Uri Geller and Sean Harabance and others that have demonstrated to us that there is something in store for us also, beyond just being people that get up every day and go to work and come home and drink, and watch football games or whatever we do. Like, there's more to humanity that's coming, and they've given us the signposts for that direction. And the pineal gland is the organ of the day. It's the zeitgeist organ. It's the one that is going to be, it's the Stargate to hyperspace, which is home. Which is why I also called the part 3 of the webinar home, because I show that hyperspace, what it really means, what it is, and how matter is structured, and that we actually come from there, and that's where we return to, and that's our place. That's where we create from, and that we only create these bodies to inhabit them from, and the other thing that's interesting is the electron part of it. So how do we get there? Like, how do we get from the mundane existence of unconsciousness, the materialism that you were describing, that seems to be exponentially increasing on the one hand, to this evolutionary leap? And it's just, I think that the people who make that evolutionary leap, it's so powerful. It's such a powerful thought to realize that you are a creator being, that most people are afraid of it. They aren't really willing to step into their power, because society around us tends to shame us if we are proud of who we are as creator beings. And we don't want to shine too brightly, because it could, pull the wrath of the universe upon us, right? This is because there's these two divergent polarities, and they're reaching a point where I think exponentially each of them is reaching a point where they're just gonna crack the other one open.
Yeah.
And so it could mean that, if we don't take there's a quote, I should read this one. This is interesting because it has a lot to do with our understanding of how we connect to the greater universe. And that's one of the quotes that got me interested in Dieter Burr's book. And I'll just read the quote. It says, "The outer cosmos is a part of us, a separate whole that only seems to be outside of us. Seen in this way, for example, our sun and basically even all stars represent our higher self, similar to an extended organ of our human body. If we now assume that cosmic waves and very specific field strengths of Earth's magnetic field lead to activation of our pineal gland and function, shouldn't we just then believe that all people now automatically will awaken? Well, like never before, it's actually now our task to define our decision to awaken in all clarity. And in other words, help from above means our own clearly defined readiness to awaken. So it's not just a matter of sitting back and just allowing, the white hats to come in, as some people say, but it's actually, we have the prime optimal conditions in the universe right now to be able to activate our own internal biology to levels we've never imagined. And we can now step into that new human being, not the one Yuval Harari's talking about, when he's talking about we are gods and we are never, now we're going to go under the skin and we're going to, change the human.
Yeah,
they want to go the transhumanist way.
Yeah, no.
They want to think that they're a creator, that they're better at creating the human genome, the DNA, than the creator was, without even understanding what it is that we actually have within us. So rather than allowing that to mature and gracefully move into it, they're actually creating destructive means to hamper that from happening. And they're going to keep doing it because, along with their world of materialism comes all those things like narcissism and egoism and absolute extreme materialism, right? That there only is you and then the strongest, that whole Darwinian thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You with the most toys at the end of the game wins, right? It's that philosophy against this more subtle one. And this is going to come to a head. But it's, I think that the part that gives me hope is that it's such a, we're getting assisted from the universe. We're not in this alone.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And maybe it isn't, like a lot of people say, oh, it's, Ashtar Command and all this stuff. But Ashtar Command has let us down for decades, man. And Nasara's not coming. This is all just a psyop. This is the kind of stuff that the other side used to keep us from getting off our butts and doing anything.
Yeah.
So instead, we should know the universe, yes, it's there. It's helping us. And we've prayed for help. We've asked for intervention.
Oh,
and
yes.
there are things going on in the cosmos which seem to be working in our favor, and we can demonstrate. And I show that also in the webinar. So let's use that. And when we embrace that fully, and when that event happens, that cosmic event, and we're long overdue for it.
Mm-hmm.
It'll determine the difference between absolute chaos and catastrophe and really a golden world, the golden age, as they like to call it. It's probably no coincidence that it's called the golden age, because there's probably remnants in the memory, in the cellular memory of the 3 billion years that our genome has been gathering information and developing genetically and establishing memories of our collective humanity that indicate that there are these things that happen. But this time it's a little different. This time we're actually going to embody that. We're not going to lose our bodies and go into chaos and have to reincarnate. We're actually going to step up, and we're going to become what I guess some of the extraterrestrial beings that are out there are not necessarily embodied in little forms, but actually they are higher beings. And JJ Hertok, who's also in the webinar incidentally, he talks about those angelic beings and what they represent, and that's like this higher level of humanity which we have waiting for us. And they want to help us too, but they can't intervene because we have free will. And that's why I read that quote, because it's up to us now to define our decision clearly, that we want to wake up with all clarity and make decisions that are conscious and disconnect, the umbilical cord from the materialist timeline, which is accelerating and moving us toward this transhumanist dystopia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, literally, I work every single day on becoming the change that I want to see in the world. And it's working. And it has these amazing effects where our relationships with people we never thought we'd get along with suddenly are better. Our health improves. The things that we really desire close to our heart and should be our birthright, like decent housing, just come into being. It's a magical, amazing reality if we just put in a little bit of effort, if we just want to. But it does take a disconnecting from the construct. And most people, they're afraid, they're terrified of stepping outside of the mainstream. And yet that's where all the beauty is. That's where everything that's worth living is. And I've had the most amazing experiences. I don't care if people believe me or not. It doesn't matter. It fuels my own evolution, which is my personal responsibility. I've often thought of, because I myself have had experience with the narcissist, relationships with narcissists, and when my life wasn't going so well. And I thought, what? Instead of giving them supply, why don't we give it to ourselves? We can give ourselves that supply, that goodness, that support, that love, everything we need. And when we do that, our lives change. We change physically, mentally, spiritually. And it's also, as you said, part of the microcosm is part of the macrocosm. It changes everything. And so I'm pretty hopeful about all of that. Now, Frank, we're coming close to the end of the show. I appreciate you coming on so much. I'm sorry about the power issues I had earlier in the show. I'm so glad that you were willing to come back and for us to actually get the recording done. I'm wondering if you would, because some people will be listening to this on an audio podcast, tell people where they can find you, where they can find the webinar, any last words you have, words of wisdom. And thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on, Karen. No worries about the fallout, this kind of stuff. We have to get used to it happening more and more. So we just have to roll with it when it happens. The best way for people to find the webinar is to go to the site that I have, which is kind of my blog site, or I don't know, for lack of a better word, cyberhive.tv. And on that site, all the webinars are listed. At the very top, you just, click on latest webinar. I think it's listed at the very top anyway, the inner looking glass. Or if you can't remember CyberHive, or if you can't spell it right or whatever, just my name, frankjacob.com. And then that will bring you to my site. So at the top of that site, at the very top of the navigation, are also links to get to CyberHive.tv and to get to the webinar, and even the films as well. We have also produced some very interesting consciousness raising films, and there's links to them there as well. And I would only really just encourage people to watch the pineal gland webinar, because like I said, I think it really does represent the zeitgeist of our current time. And it's really got a lot of information that I don't think really anyone has ever really put together in such a fashion, and connected in these kind of dots together, because it takes us from the birth of civilization right up into where we're going to head into in the future. It's not just simply about the pineal gland, but the pineal gland is the main glue that binds this whole story together. And there's philosophy involved. There's science involved. There's the new structure of matter in the universe involved, the spins of electrons, DNA. It's a very, very interesting, multifaceted series, which goes a lot of unexpected directions. I think most people would have to agree with that. So yeah, and it's going to prepare us for some of the really crazy times that are ahead. No doubt, we're going to be facing. We've seen an escalation of these shock events, and Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum are on the record as saying that the only way to move society in the direction they want to is to do it through shock events. And so they're going to be trying to dish up more shock events. And so, what I tried to do with the webinars to give us the tools to navigate those shocks, and to most importantly, maybe don't get affected by those shocks as much as you would if you didn't have that arsenal of information at your side. So that's all I can say. And I really do hope that more and more people begin to tune into the power of their own creative beingness, and to realize that you don't need to do any, that's another thing. You don't necessarily need to practice any kind of exercises or do anything like out of the ordinary to make your pineal gland become active. I mean, there are some things you can do that have to do with diet, and I also include that kind of like a sheet at the end that you can download, and it gives you here's the sort of a recipe list of what you can do to activate your pineal gland. But more than anything, it's just when you begin to go through something like this, like a 3-part deep dive into it, you're even alone the very fact that you're thinking about your pineal gland, that you're putting your focus there, you're beginning to activate it, and you're going to start shaking off electromagnetically the things that are coating it and blocking it, which are in our environment. So you can actually change your actual frequency through the way that you change, and that results in you changing the spin of the electrons even that make up the body that you're in. So you become less and less affected by the things around you. And I think you mentioned it beautifully before, that the more you're doing, you're feeling that you're less in fear and you're feeling more empowered. This is going to happen to everybody that begins to practice this discipline. So I can only encourage people to do that. Of course, I've tried to make it easy through the webinar. You can spare yourself buying and reading a ton of books and watching films and stuff. It's highly condensed, intensive information. It's got some of the leading thinkers and scientists in that field that were at my disposal and made themselves available so that could sit at their feet and pump them for information. And then we go through it together and we lay it all out, and it's easy to understand. And I think that's the best thing I can suggest for now.
Fantastic. Yes, I'm a firm believer that intention is definitely a large part of it. Just the intention, the wanting of things to be different. Well, thank you again, Frank, so much for being on the show. And thank you to all the viewers and the listeners. I appreciate you so much. Without you, I wouldn't have a show. And I'll see you next week again on the Quantum Guide Show. Bye-bye, everybody. Check out my online shop, www.KarenHoltonHealthCoach.com. to find Zendome's orgone generators, comfort crystals, and an array of vital services, all designed to help you to become the change that you wish to see in the world. Check out my website and find many valuable resources. There's the 9 Steps to Quantum Health Transformation. This is a free, comprehensive online course. Learn about detoxification and nutrition, grounding and spiritual practices, and an advanced version of the law of attraction, giving you more of what you really want out of life. I also have my Zendome's Orgonite, which is my unique brand of orgone generators. They're ethically sourced and handmade by a friend of mine, and they're double charged for maximum effect. I also carry comfort crystals, which is a limited collection of energetically infused semi-precious stones. I have an array of vital services, so you can get the one-on-one support that you've been looking for. Also coaching, guidance, and I do assessments and also workshops. And then again, there are the many free resources available on my website. Wisdom to assist with energetic ascension into physical, mental, and spiritual paradise. Let us share our quantum work with you. It's your turn to heal, evolve, and thrive. Believe in your ability to succeed. Thank you for joining us on the Quantum Guide Show. Become the change that you wish to see in the world. Subscribe to my YouTube, Odyssey, and Telegram channels. Like this video and share it with your friends. You can also find the Quantum Guide Show and my other podcast called Aliens and Astrology on the Forbidden Knowledge News Network. That's www.forbiddenknowledge.news. And while you're at it, check out my website, www.karenholtonhealthcoach.com, where you will find some amazing products and services and an abundance of free resources to help you with your journey. All of the links are in the description below. And in the meantime, until we see you next week, keep up the good work.
Puts all my inner strife to rest, for time gives birth to hurriedness. It all makes sense, well, more or less, and the sages put me to their test. With heart and soul I do my best to find the answers to my quest. I wonder and I must confess, I don't know where it comes from, but I know it's okay. If this is all an illusion,